Hello everyone, and welcome to the Fall 2020 Plant Sale. This sale is being co-hosted by the Clear Lake chapter of the Native Plant Society of Texas and the Environmental Institute of Houston. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Rowena McDermid, and I work for the Environmental Institute of Houston as an environmental education specialist. So what does this mean, you say? Well, it's a great question. I help organize programs and workshops. I help look after the habitat garden. Sometimes we call it an outdoor lab. And I spend a lot of time taking children out into nature and trying to teach them about nature and the environment. I am, as you can tell from my accent, not a born and bred Texan, but I've been here for 15 years now. So I like to think that I've been here long enough that you feel you can adopt me. And my main qualification for doing this talk is that I'm the chair of the Clear Lake chapter of the chair of the plant committee of the Clear Lake chapter. So I just couldn't persuade anybody else to do this talk, so you stuck with me. Today we're going to cover why should we go native? What is the reason us native plant enthusiasts keep on going on about planting natives? What's wrong with all the things we've been using for the last 50 years in our gardens? And also I'm going to spend some time going over some of the plants that are on sale today. I'm not going to be covering everything as we have over 50 species on sale. While I was looking for inspiration for this talk, I'd watched a video by Douglas Tallamy. Now he's a professor of entomology and wildlife ecology at the University of Delaware. And he has recently written a book called Nature's Best Hope. And he has a talk which is available to watch on YouTube by the same title. And it is an excellent talk, and I would really recommend that you go and check it out if you possibly can. And this book's definitely going on my Christmas list. So, as many of you may know already, although some of you may not, native plants are locally adapted. So what that means is they tend to grow very well around here because they're used to, in the area where you're growing, where they're native, because they're used to the conditions. They're used to the soil, they're used to the heat, they're used to the going extremely dry and then a couple of weeks later being almost 6 inches underwater. So they have evolved in these conditions and they know how to deal with them. They tend to thrive a lot better than some other plants that we try and bring into into our landscape. It helps to preserve the plants because, as we all know, the habitat areas are decreasing, more and more buildings are going up, the suburbia is increasing, agriculture is taking up space, and development in the whole is taking up space. And as the ground where these things grow in the wild becomes less and less, it becomes more of an issue that these plants might actually go extinct, especially the ones which are a little bit rarer, perhaps not so popular in the landscape. And it helps us appreciate these plants and give them a space in the environment if we put them in our yards. Another reason is for seasonality. As a transplant into Texas, I speak to many other transplants, and a theme that comes up often is how they miss the change of seasons from where they came from. They don't like the fact that Houston just seems to have 2 seasons, a wet one and a hot one. And I think a lot of the reason that they feel that way is that because the planting around them doesn't show the change of seasons. You plant native plants in your garden, you are going to get a change with each season as one kind of plant finishes off and the next kind of plant starts blooming. Right from early spring all the way through fall, there's going to be a different palette of plants available to enjoy in your landscape. And of course, one of the main reasons people choose native plants is because it's beneficial to wildlife. They like having the pollinator plants so that the butterflies and the bees can enjoy the nectar. They enjoy growing native milkweeds so that they can do their thing for the monarchs. And you know, having trees and flies and all sorts of things, lots of different insects in their yards. And that is all well and good. But What if you go to the nursery and they don't have a native plant, but they've got another plant, which is an excellent pollinator plant, and then you put that in your yard instead? Wouldn't that be just as good? Well, yes, better than putting in a plant that doesn't provide nectar, but you're just providing nectar. And we have to remember that insects have a multi-stage life cycle, and very often the larval stage of that life cycle has a completely different diet to the adults. So we've got to make sure that we're feeding the youngsters as well as the adults. A lot of larvae, in particular caterpillars, eat plants. And plants are chemical factories. They manufacture toxins, many of which we use as medicines, but the reasons they manufacture them is to protect themselves against being eaten by insects. And most insects will only be able to survive if they're given a diet of plants that they have co-evolved with. Those are the ones which they can consume without becoming sick. There are some insects which can eat anything and everything, and they do. But there are very, very, very many which are specific to one or two genera. And if you do not provide those plants, those insects will suffer. A recent UN report concluded that 1 million species face extinction over the next 20 years. And most of these species are insects. And life as we know it depends on insects. So I know many of you think, oh, well, I can do without mosquitoes in my life. But just think if all insects disappeared, even if most insects disappeared, most flowering plants would go extinct. And that would change the structure of the terrestrial habitats and the energy flow within those habitats, because most insects which eat the plants then provide food which hold up the food webs. So if the food webs collapse, then you have lack of food for amphibians, for reptiles, for birds, and for mammals. The biosphere would rot due to a loss of insect decomposers. And so the question is, could humanity survive this? Well, another question could be, why would we want to? Can you imagine a world without flowers and a world without birds? Because birds need caterpillars. Caterpillars transfer more energy from plants than any other plant eaters. Most birds rear their young on a diet which is mostly caterpillars. And chickadees, in fact, rear their young on a diet that is only caterpillars. So Dr. Tallamy, he had a research student look at this, and they did a study, and they found a pair of chickadees will need to catch between 6,000 and 10,000 caterpillars to rear a single clutch until they leave the nest. Now remember, that's only until they leave the nest. The next few weeks are still dependent on their parents for food. So a pair of chickadees will literally have to catch thousands and thousands and thousands of caterpillars for their young. So why caterpillars? What makes them so special? Well, they're soft and they're squishy and they're easy to push down the young's throat. They are very nutritious, high in protein and fat. And I think it doesn't hurt that they don't fly away. So what we need to do when we're thinking about gardening for insects is, as well as thinking about gardening for the adults, we need to garden for caterpillars. Which brings me on to keystone species. A keystone species is defined as a species on which other species in an ecosystem largely depend, such that if it were removed, the ecosystem would change drastically. Now, I think we're all aware of some species like beavers and wolves that play a very important role in the environment, but plants can be important species as well. And so the National Wildlife Federation has actually on their website got a native plant finder, and you can put in your postcode, and it will give you a list of the most useful flowers, grasses, trees, and shrubs in your area. And it ranks those by the number of species of moths and butterflies that actually use these species as host plants. So it supports the caterpillars. And for the flowers, no surprise, the solidago or the goldenrods supports 82 different species. Sunflowers, 81 different species. Hibiscus, 38 different species. Baccharis, so that's in the prairie. I don't think many people grow it in their yards. Then there's also Eupatorium, or the thoroughworts, 33 species. As impressive as these numbers are, the heavyweights in this department are actually the trees and the shrubs, but specifically oak trees. The genus Quercus supports 468 different species of moths and butterflies, closely followed by the prunus, 270, willow, 299. You can see the other numbers there. So if you want to encourage birds in your yard, the single most important thing you can do is plant some species of oak tree. So if you plant native plants instead of non-native plants, will it actually make a difference? I mean, we each only have a small yard. We live in suburbia. On the left, I've got a picture of a typical yard in our neighborhood. Very neat, very tidy, very manicured. When you look at it closely, you see they've got some nice little pom-poms, probably made of some kind of privet, which isn't native. They've got sago palms, which isn't native. They've got what looks like a crepe myrtle, which isn't native. Got a lot of mulch down. And there's really not a lot there to support wildlife. In the next photograph on the right is in the same neighborhood. The garden bed isn't actually that much bigger, but it's filled with native plants. There's a lot less bare soil of it, that you can see, or the mulch on the ground that you can see, and that will support a lot more wildlife. And as you can see, the amount of space taken up is not that different, and it may not look quite as manicured as the picture on the left. It's perfectly acceptable as far as I'm concerned. Oh, and now I was going to show you a little clip. So I am going to do a new share. And I've got a little movie clip to show you from the presentation I was talking about earlier. And here we go.
That's 10 acres. If you live in the middle of suburbia, you don't have 10 acres. Will it work on smaller properties? And the answer is yes. How do I know? Well, we can go to Margie and Dan Terpstra's house. This is in Kirkwood, Missouri, and that's a traditional suburban house. I was there this early this spring, and they are surrounded by typical suburbia. So there's no connectivity with natural areas, but they built a feature in their backyard that they called a bubbler. It's a little water feature that bubbles away. They have 0.6 acres, so less than an acre, and it was loaded with their major invasive, which is bush honeysuckle. They got rid of the bush honeysuckle, they added native plants, and they have recorded 149 bird species on their property, 35 warbler species. So just in comparison, on our 10 acres, we've only recorded 8 warbler species at our house. So the Terpstras are doing really well. As a matter of fact, they do so well, she's got a blog where she shows the species of warblers that have come each week. What about urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's yard. She only has 1/10 of an acre. And she lives right in the center of Chicago. She actually lives right next to the Chicago airport, and tiny little property. She has changed her backyard. She didn't do anything in the front yard because she didn't have a front yard. It's just a cement slab. But she put in a little water feature. She put in, 60 species of native plants on this 1/10 of an acre, which is 3 times smaller than the average U.S. lot. She's 1/2 block from the Chicago's Kennedy Expressway and is directly adjacent to one of O'Hare Airport's runways. Again, no connectivity with preserved land. She's got 1/10 of an acre, which is an island in Chicago. But she's recorded, this is an old figure, I think it's 113 species of birds have used her yard, including a woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, you can go to Pam's property in Chicago and see a woodcock. What about city centers themselves? Well, in 2014, I was staring at this butterfly weed plant, which reminds me, we have a terrible issue with marketing our native plants. We call them all weeds, which gives us cultural permission to kill them all. So we're not going to call this butterfly weed anymore. We're going to call it Monarch's Delight. So I was staring at Monarch's Delight, and the first thing I saw was this megachilid bee. I know it's a megachilid bee because it's carries its pollen on its tummy, not on its legs. And it's there sipping nectar. I hadn't seen this species in a while. There was another species there that I had never seen. There you go. And the megachilids were there because they had what they needed. What they need is pollen and nectar and soft leaves. What they do, like redbud leaves, these are redbuds. They cut the edge out of the redbud leaf, they roll it up, stuff it full of pollen, and then put it into a crack. Well, there was redbud there, and that redbud blooms, and that's why there's early forage for bumblebees that were also there. These are queen bumblebees that need these early flowers so they can start their colonies all by themselves. And there were other flowering plants as well. But then I saw a monarch, and then I saw another monarch, two monarchs. This was June 2014. I hadn't seen a single monarch in 2013. Their population was so low. So this was very exciting. And it was early. It's hard for monarchs to get up the East Coast that early. So very encouraging. And they were there because they had monarchs delight, and they also had other species of milkweeds. Do you know where I was? I was on the High Line in the middle of Manhattan, and this is what we're talking about here. This is the strip of plants. Not all of them are native, but most of them are, that are good enough to bring in the wildlife that I saw. And that was in 15 minutes in the middle of Manhattan. This, of course, is an elevated railroad line that is now one of the major tourist attractions in Manhattan. Attracts, I don't know how many, over 1 million, maybe it's a couple million people each year. Well, the creatures that are using these plants don't care. The point is, I never thought that this would happen, but if we put thoughtful native plantings pretty much anywhere, it's going to work. I never thought it would work in the middle of Manhattan, but it is working. And if it can work there, I am convinced we really can bring life back to pretty much any place.
Okay, so we are back with a slideshow, and this time everything didn't crash, so here's hoping. This is the first of several sages that we have for sale. This is leaf sage, or Salvia lyrata. I am trying myself to try and use the binomial names more often. It causes a lot less confusion than using common names, but I'm human like everybody else. I tend to default to common names when I'm not sure or when I can't remember. And sometimes it's the easiest thing to think of. So I think it's a journey for all of us. This is a nice little plant because it will tolerate shade. So a lot of our suburban gardens are quite shady, and it's nice to have plants that will tolerate shade. They will propagate themselves. They bloom in the spring, pale blue color, and they propagate easily from seed, and they will increase their population on their own if you leave them to it. The next sage is the Salvia coccinea, or the scarlet sage. This will take sun or partial shade. It's a perennial. It tends to bloom and then die back a bit. So if you can cut the flower heads off after they bloom, prevent it from going to seed, you can probably get a longer bloom life out of it. It's very attractive to bees and hummingbirds. And it grows very easily from either seeds or cuttings. This year in the sale, we're also offering a white variety of the Salvia coccinea. On the website, when you get to the sale, it will be listed separately. It won't be listed as a variety of the scarlet sage. It just seemed less confusing at the time. Okay, let's carry on. Okay, the blue sage, the one we often see out in the prairie. As you can see, I had to show this photograph off. I took it at the Deer Park Prairie a few years ago, and you can see how the beautiful blue sage is blooming against the Gulf muley. And this plant will bloom from the spring all the way through the fall. It tends to be tall and delicate, but if you pinch it out, you do get a bushier plant. And if you keep on deadheading it, it will continue to bloom. Again, this is one that will propagate easily from seeds and cuttings, and a small clump can become a larger clump that way. The next one is blue mist flower, Conoclinium sorry, I'm going to butcher this, Celestinium. It grows very easily. Use it with care. It is a great fall bloomer. It's great for bees and for monarchs when they're coming back down into the south. It'll bloom in the spring and then bloom again in the fall, but it does spread very, very easily. It can become a nuisance in your yard. So very pretty though. So there's worse things to become a nuisance. Another one that's very important for the fall migration is the Verbicina virginica, or the frostweed. This is an interesting plant because it's got a nice close-up photograph of the flowers here. The plant itself doesn't look that interesting. It goes tall, it has small, insignificant white blooms on top. But if you're living in an area where you get frosts, it just comes into its own because it will leak sap after a frost. And it creates these beautiful swirly patterns. So the next day when you wake up, you've got these wonderful frost creations made out of sap in your backyard. It is, as I said, very important nectaring plant. It tends to grow on the edges of woodlands and things. So somewhere where it gets shade for part of the day is probably a very good place for it to be. And it will propagate itself as well. So you've always got seedlings to give to your neighbors. This is a star plant, seaside goldenrod, and I am, rather than talking about it myself, I'm going to give you a break and let somebody else talk about it. So here we go, I hope.
Thank you for welcoming me to your garden. Can you show me this plant, please?
Well, this of course is my favorite, seaside goldenrod, Solidago sempervirens. It was our plant of the month last month, and it's just gorgeous. It's finally blooming. It's had pollinators on it all day. It's not, oh, here we go. Right here's a little honeybee. I don't know if you can see
No,
that.
I missed that, but never mind. So is this about as tall as it grows, or can it get taller than this?
Well, it can get taller. This one came from one of the giveaways at EIH earlier this year. And I didn't cut it back because it was kind of small to begin with. But if you would like to have it a little bit shorter than this, you can cut it back in the month of June, and it will still flower in October. And so that's a great idea. If you have a limited space, you could cut it back and it won't get quite so tall.
Okay. So when did yours actually start blooming? Is it just in the last couple of weeks or so?
It just started like October the 1st, I would say.
Okay, so it's definitely a fall bloomer. And you've told me you've seen lots of pollinators on it already.
Oh yes, definitely.
Okay. This is an especially important plant for the monarch migration down to Mexico, isn't it?
Oh yes, absolutely. So these are blooming right at the same time that the monarchs are coming through Clear Lake, Texas. So yes, we're lucky to have it blooming at that time because it's really one of the few things that are blooming. Some of the sunflowers are blooming right now, and there's frostweed that we have blooming right now. But a lot of the other things like the black-eyed Susans and the purple cone flowers, those have kind of finished. We do have the blue mist flower that's blooming now as well.
Okay, well thank you, Wendy.
Oh, you're welcome.
Okay, here I am back on the screen. Yes, you could see the bee flying off in that video. I'm sorry, I apologize for my senior moment in the middle of filming that. But Wendy did provide another little clip of a bee on her goldenrod, which I thought we could show for fun. Here we go. Oh. So there we are. The next one on our list is the Maximilian sunflower. I tried to say the Latin name of this earlier and I got into a tongue twist. It's a helianthus though. It's very useful in the fall for attracting pollinators, bees and butterflies, provides nectar for them. It also provides a lovely fall show in the garden. Nothing like a sunflower for a nice bright display. It's different from the ordinary sunflowers that you might remember growing from seed as a kid, and that you get multiple blooms on the one stem. And the blooms are slightly smaller and it doesn't grow quite as tall as those sunflowers, although it can get quite tall. So this is another plant which, as it's starting to grow and you see it getting big in the summer, you might want to think about cutting it back just to restrain, the height it gets to when it eventually blooms. Please note that we're selling these not as plants, but we were donated some bare roots. It propagates through rhizomes and it can form quite a big clump. And one of our members decided she wanted to cut back on her clump. And so she's got these live bare roots, which we are selling to you, and keep them damp. And they will get them into the ground as soon as you can. And they will give you a nice big bush next year. Okay, another superstar is Missouri ironweed, another perennial. It likes the sun, it can grow in part shade, and it's dormant in winter. And this is another one that can get quite tall if you let it, but you also see it grow very short in the prairie. And I think it's when the prairie gets mown or it gets eaten, then it just blooms when it's short. And you can mimic that in your garden by cutting them back in the early summer or the late spring, and then your blooms won't be quite so high. This is another one that can spread, but it is so pretty. I certainly don't mind it spreading in my yard. Okay, so we have two kinds of native milkweeds on sale today, the most of which is aquatic milkweed. This is a very easy milkweed to grow. It's easy to keep. It tends to bloom for a long period of time. Despite the name, it doesn't need to be in water. It doesn't even need to be watered all the time. I mean, it likes it when you water it, but you can forget for a few weeks and it'll be fine. The reason it's called aquatic milkweed is that its seed pods, unlike other milkweeds, aren't covered in fluff. And so the seeds, instead of floating away in the wind, they tend to float away in the water. And that's why it's called aquatic milkweed. It does tend to grow next to ditches and things, but it'll do just fine in your backyard. We also have some Asclepias incarnata, or the swamp milkweed, available in the sale. Again, you do not need a swamp to plant it, although it will do particularly well in a rain garden. Okay. The Eryngium yuccifolium, a well-named plant. It can be very prickly in the seed heads, but before it reaches that stage, when it's a young plant, the stems are actually quite soft and very interesting. It's an interesting plant to have in your landscape. It's not everybody's cup of tea, but I would say it's an essential plant to have in a pocket prairie or a prairie garden. And very important for pollinators and also little spiders and things like that who attempt to live in them. The Amsonia, this one is one that likes to grow. It's happiest when it's got quite a bit of moist soil and it's growing in a little bit of shade. We've got it going extremely well in our rain garden. Forms quite a big bush eventually, and it dies back each year, but it comes back and grows and blooms, multiple blooms, great big clusters of them over one plant. And when it's happy and it spreads itself. But it's a very pretty plant and not one that you see often for sale. So I hope you take advantage of this. Spider lilies. We have them on sale at a reduced price because we have so many. We had such a good year for propagating spider lilies. These are gorgeous. In the wild, you'll see them in ditches and in low spots. In the spring, these beautiful, very ornamental, fragrant flowers. You take them home, put them in your rain garden, put them in a low spot, put them in a garden that gets regularly watered through a sprinkler system. You will be delighted. And I hope you do take the opportunity to take several back with you. frog fruit is another favorite because it tends to grow along the ground like a grass. And so it can provide a ground cover. It can grow in the lawn. It can take over from the lawn grass. And if you're one of those people that really doesn't mind that happening, you're going to enjoy frog fruit. It's a low evergreen when it's not blooming, but it does have a long bloom season. And of course, it's quite a close-up photograph, but the blooms are delicate and, and are actually a larval host for several species of butterflies and moths. This is another pretty one, the salt marshmallow. It looks like a hibiscus, but it's in a different genus. This is a short-lived perennial. It'll live for about 5 years. It'll die back in the winter. It'll grow tall up to about 3 or 4 feet in the summer months and have these lovely, delicate pink blooms on it. A very pretty one to have in your flower bed mixed in with other blooming plants. This is a new one for us this year, a woolly mallow, Hibiscus laciocarpus. I found out it's also called false cotton because the flowers resemble those of the cotton plant, which is related to hibiscus. It's an upright perennial. It can grow up to 5 feet. It's quite tall, and the blooms, as you can see in the picture with the hand behind it to scale, do get quite large as well. They're usually white or pale pink with a deep crimson eye in the center, very eye-catching. And again, hibiscus do like a lot of water, but they're also used to going without for a time. So it being a native plant, you have the advantage there of going to the nursery and getting one of the cultivars. Turk's cap, always a favorite, especially with children. They love it when you pick the flower and let them eat the nectar from the bottom of the flower. It does well from a haircut each year and you prune it right back to the ground. The berries fall off quite quickly, so the berries aren't much of a show, but it does bloom. It's October, mine is still blooming. It's been blooming since early summer. It propagates well from softwood cuttings and a very pretty plant. Again, it does well in the shade. Virginia sweet spire, Ilia virginica. This is a deciduous shrub. Beautiful blooms in the springtime. It can cope in the shade, it can cope in the sun. What it does like is a moist spot. This is more of a wetland plant, so somewhere that's going to get regular water is a good spot for this. Again, it'll grow from cuttings. We've grown it from cuttings. We haven't managed it from seeds yet, but we do have quite a few available for you. Wendy did a good job growing those this year. An American beautyberry, another one of my favorites, the Calicarpa americana, another deciduous shrub. The main attraction for this, although it does have blooms in spring and early summer, is that it has these beautiful deep purple berries later on in the summer and into the fall, and the birds love them. Once the birds have found them, and the robins are especially good at this, and the cedar waxwings will also come through, unfortunately, the berries do not survive a visit from them. They just strip the bush clean. But until then, you get to enjoy the berries. And as you can see, they are beautiful. It can grow quite tall. I have been out in the woods and seeing it growing up to 6 feet tall. But it's another one of these bushes that you can keep in check with some judicious pruning. It'll only grow as tall as you let it. I have seen varieties with white berries. I do not believe those are native. So be careful when you go to the garden center. You might get sold one which isn't native. Look for the one with the purple berries. Buttonbush, another one of my favorites. This can be a shrub or it can be a small tree. It does well in wet sites, but it does grow in dry sites as well. It's especially loved by bees. It's known as a honey tree. I've seen lots of moths and butterflies nectaring on it as well. And its distinctive thing is that it's got little blooms that form small clusters, and the pistils go beyond the fringe of the petals, and you end up with something that looks like a pom-pom, and it's really, really pretty, very pretty. Blooms for several weeks in the summer. Coral honeysuckle. It's The yellow honeysuckle that is so common in the wild is actually an invasive species. The coral honeysuckle is the native one. It's not hard to grow. I really don't understand why everyone doesn't have a plant one of these in their backyard. It's growing over my back fence at the moment. Beautiful. It's been blooming for a long time. It's easy to propagate from cuttings. Doesn't require a lot of TLC. It doesn't mind if you water it or not. I mean, once it's established, when it's in the pot or it's newly planted, you've got to give it some water. But after it's established, you can just forget about it. It takes care of itself. Again, another one for the hummingbirds. Another vine we're offering is the cross vine. These are related to the trumpet vines, Bignonia capreolata. This is also a climbing vine, and this one doesn't actually need a support. So be careful where you plant it, because it can very easily climb up a building or climb up a fence, supporting itself by tendrils. So if you do not want a creeper climbing up your building willy-nilly, maybe plant it against a fence instead. In the summer, the leaves are beautiful green, and they fade to reddish purple in the winter. Lance leaf coreopsis. Now, unlike the coreopsis or the tick seeds that you get in the, that you see a lot out in the fields where there's so many of them blooming in the spring, those tend to be annuals. This particular species is a perennial. So you can plant it and it'll come back year after year. It'll last for a few years, but it self-propagates and it'll quickly form into a clump. Very pretty. And another advantage of this plant is once the flowers die back, the foliage remains behind and forms a nice little mat in your garden bed, which acts as a ground cover. The rough coneflower. Rudbeckia grandiflora, also known as the tall coneflower. Again, if you are going to have a prairie garden or a pocket prairie, having either the rough coneflower or the Texas coneflower is an absolute must in my book. But these can look wonderfully attractive in the landscape as well. The flowers, the leaves tend to stay quite close to the ground, and the flowers bloom in this long, tall stalk that can go up 5-6 feet even sometimes. This big, distinctive flower head on it. It's attractive enough to leave over the winter because the birds will eat the seeds from the seed head. If it falls down and becomes unattractive, you can cut it back and the rosette will remain on the ground to act as ground cover. It's not a big plant, so you don't even need to plant it at the back of your bed against the wall, because other plants can be seen through it. And it's probably best not to do that because they do like some sun. This Mexican hat, Ratibida columnifera, not a coneflower, although it does look like a coneflower, much shorter and smaller than coneflowers and very common by the roadside. I'm sure everyone's seen them there. So this is got them on sale, and they're very small at the moment. Put them in the ground, and next year I'm sure they will look very pretty. If you plant it in the sun, it does prefer to be planted in the sun. It should grow up to a 2-foot mound. If it starts to die back later on this season when it gets hot, you can cut it back a little bit. Just be careful not to damage the basil flowers or cut too much back of the foliage. You need to be a little bit more careful with this one. But again, if you keep deadheading it, it'll keep on blooming for you. And the rock rose. So those of you who have visited us at EIH know that we have some rock roses in our garden. Those are not the native ones. Those are actually ones that were bought from a nursery when our garden was first installed. So we're very excited to be able to offer you a native Bevonia, Bevonia lacceopetala. It is more of a hill country plant than it is a Gulf Coast plant, but it should do well in the sun as long as you've got, not very thirsty, as long as you've got a garden bed with some well-drained soil, it should do well in there. It blooms from late spring into the fall, and it is related to the hibiscus. So, you will notice that the blooms will open up in the morning and then close again in the evening. But it doesn't get too tall. It grows up to about 3 feet. Sometimes it can look a bit leggy. You can prune it back. It'll fill out. Again, it's a short-lived perennial, so it reseeds itself very happily. Leave some of those seedlings alone And so when the plants die back, when they're about 4 years old, the new ones can grow in to take their place. Gulf Coast penstemon. So this is another perennial, and it can be evergreen in the winter, or it can go dormant depending on where you live. It tends to stay evergreen here in Houston, although the leaves can get quite dark. It does best in partial shade, gets covered in blooms, very attractive plant, and it doesn't get too tall either. It does colonize, and it's another one that can be used for ground cover. The red-flowered false yucca, Hesperaloe parviflora. This is another hill country plant. It's attractive to hummingbirds. It likes the soil on the drier side, so don't plant it anywhere where you water too often. But it's an attractive plant, and it'll add, you know, a different feature into your garden, or you might want to put it in a pot or whatever. Eastern red columbine is another one we borrowed from the Edwards Plateau. It is just so pretty. And it doesn't like the heat. So plant it somewhere in the semi-shade. It'll do best there. Somewhere that's not waterlogged, but is moist. So in a corner of your yard where you've got some trees growing that shade it, that's well watered, maybe even in a pot. I was asked a few weeks ago about native plants for hanging baskets, and I didn't think about this one, but this might be another good one to put in a hanging basket. It's a woodland flower, so you know, just think about that when you plant it, and so pretty. Okay, now we're starting on the grasses, and we're offering several to sale today. Lindheimer muley is another one we borrowed from the hill country, but it does really well in Houston. It forms a big specimen plant. In the fall, it has beautiful silvery plumes on it. It can get quite tall. It's a good replacement for pampas grass as a specimen plant, but it also looks good if you plant it en masse, and you know, you just fill a big area with it. A favorite, Gulf muley, and I couldn't help but put in another photograph of Gulf muley with some, there's some gay flower here, the Atris pycnostacia, and here is the blue sage growing in the prairie. Again, Deer Park Prairie, if you get an opportunity to visit out there, please do. And in the background here, I think it's goldenrod blooming. So yes, I think everyone's familiar with this plant. In the fall, it has these beautiful pink inflorescences. If you plant a lot of them together, you get something that looks like a pink mist. It grows about knee-high, doesn't get too tall, and it likes full sun or part shade. Yes, in fact, the groundsmen at the university have fallen so much in love with this grass that I'm actually having to argue with them to perhaps plant something else. Eastern gamagrass, a nice clumpy grass if you want to fill a lot of space. Very interesting seed heads on it. It'll get to about 3 feet wide and 3 feet tall. That might get a bit taller, but it's the seed heads that grow up and make this a taller plant. Very interesting seed heads. They look like a turkey foot. You have the male and female flowers on the same inflorescence, and they form these big yellow seeds that birds like to eat. It does well in a damp spot. It's another one that's good for a rain garden. It's doing very well at EIH and forming quite big clumps without us having to intervene at all. So that's another good one for a mass planting. Inland sea oats is a nice short grass. It only grows a couple of feet tall, and this is one that will grow in the shade. There's not many grasses that will grow in the shade, but this one will. It might make a good alternative to ferns under trees. It doesn't like complete shade. A little bit of sun during some part of the day is ideal, but you'll get the seed heads forming fairly early on in the summer, and they start off green and they ripen slowly through the fall, and they'll turn from this green to kind of an ivory color and eventually turn an attractive shade of brown, and they're very pretty. They clump up quite quickly. You can trim them back in the early spring to get new growth that year. another one of my favorites. This year, we're offering purple lovegrass, Eragrostis spectabilis. This is very similar in appearance to the Gulf Coast muley. Again, it has this beautiful mist-like inflorescence, more of a kind of a reddish purple than a pink, but again, if you like that kind of thing, this is another grass for you. Another one that will look very good if you plant several of them together. And that ends the plants that we're talking about for today. I would just like to give you a few tips when you go shopping on site. Just in a few minutes, we're going to be putting up a chat link with the direct link to get you to the sale. It's been hosted, we're hosting it on a Square website. So they give us the template and we just fill it. You can sort the plant list out by type, or you can sort it alphabetically if you need to try and find your plant. They're listed by common names, so you'll find them alphabetically by common name. One word of warning, the inventory only updates when you check out. So if you have something in your cart, it doesn't actually take it out of inventory. So what you might find is when you actually get to checkout, it's not actually in your cart anymore because it's been sold before you manage to get to checkout. So what I would suggest is if there's something you particularly want, go and put it in your cart, go straight to checkout, and then check out, make sure you have it, and then go back into the website and do your browsing. There's two opportunities to sign up for the pickup. There is a link to take you to Sign Up Genius. One, just as you check out, and if you don't get around to doing it then, if you forget for some reason, because you're in a hurry, perhaps, when you get your confirmation email for your order, which will happen automatically, there is another live link in that email, so you can sign up a pickup time. If you are ordering several things, if you go take my advice and go into the site several times and end up generating several orders, you still only need to book one pickup time. And in the comment section, just write your different order numbers in so we can have them all ready for you. And the other thing is, please bring your order number with you when you come to collect your plants. We will be organizing them ready for pickup in order number order. So if you can bring your number with you, it will be very helpful enough to us finding your order for you. And before I sign off, I would like to thank the volunteers so much for all the hard work they did at bringing the sale to you, especially Debbie, our webmaster, who spent so much time organizing everything onto the website so it's easy for you to use and navigate. You can see exactly what you're getting, exactly what things cost. I hope you enjoy shopping there. And I'm hoping next time we do a plant sale, it will be back to the live version. Thank you very much.